the GLP-1 drugs are one of those sort of 12 to 15 possibilities. They're generating so much press. If they really get approval for multiple age-related diseases, it could be that they're the thing that convinced people of the geroscience paradigm. And if that happens, then regardless of how good they are long-term, they will be super great for the field.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Dr. Gil Blander. Welcome to Longevity by Design, how to live healthier life. We are produced by Inside Tracker, your science-based guide to optimize your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. Karl Pfleger. Karl is a leading angel investor, philanthropist, and advocate in the field of aging and longevity. After a successful career in technology, including role at Google and MySimon, Karl has turned his focus to advancing rejuvenation biotechnology. He is the creator of AgingBiotech.info, a widely respected, completely non-commercial public resource that organizes and tracks progress in the aging biotech industry. Beyond this, Karl has invested in over 15 startups targeting damage repair approach to aging, such as senolytics and partial epigenetic reprogramming. He also founded Vitamin D for All.org and actively shares insight on the intersection of vitamin D, aging, and health on social media. His work bridges science, technology, and investment to accelerate meaningful intervention for human healthspan and lifespan. In this episode, we'll explore his unique perspective on the future of longevity, promising intervention, and evaluation of global aging biotech ecosystem. Welcome, Karl.
Thanks so much for having me. I've listened to the podcast for years. It's an honor.
Thank you so much. And I know you also for years, and you are a very respected and a very interesting persona in the aging research domain. So it's a great pleasure to interview you. And before we'll deep into longevity and biotech and investment, I would like to start with a bit of background about you, and specifically what inspired you to become a scientist.
I've always been a scientific kind of minded guy. I really, I was inspired by, my parents gave me good opportunities to do, kid science, and I always liked science in school. But particularly my freshman year of physics, high school physics teacher was very good, and one of my favorite, probably my favorite teacher that I've ever had. And when I went to college, I originally thought I was going to do physics, and then this was Princeton, and then I quickly decided that physics was actually boring when you get to the college level, and what was exciting was artificial intelligence and how brains work. And so I studied cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and AI. And my approach to science has always been to straddle the engineering and science divide. So I went into computer science at Princeton, where they have an actual engineering degree program, not just the humanities and arts and sciences. And I was always on that kind of dividing line where I was halfway between the how do brains work and then how do we make practical use of that. And after doing that at Stanford for a PhD and then doing some practical problems at Google, after about a decade at Google, I decided I wanted to focus on aging biology because it was the thing that kills the most people in the world and is the best way to improve everything. But it was also both a scientific and an engineering thing like AI. So
and it's interesting that a few decades ago you studied AI, and today AI is the most exciting maybe domain at news.
Yeah,
So
I actually studied
definitely,
deepening neural networks at Stanford in the 90s when they were not popular
yeah,
at
exactly.
that particular place. And it was, we just didn't have the compute power to do what we do now. But
Yeah,
it was the right idea.
exactly. And I think that if we're looking at revolution, AI revolution, I assume that everyone that read the news know about that. But another revolution is longevity and aging. And I know that you and me agree with that.
Yeah.
And maybe let's start with a big picture and maybe a field overview. So, how do you see the current state of longevity biotech field at a high level?
So there's a couple of different ways to paint a high level picture here. One aspect is how does the field break down? Another aspect is what's the current state. So let me just say a couple quick things. I mean, you could talk about this for half an hour, but a couple quick things. The high level distinction, besides diagnostics versus therapeutics, which you have in any kind of bio and medical context, within therapeutics, the real big distinction is that the most of the field right now is looking for ways to slow the rate of aging. And most of the existing therapies we have, that's what they do. They tweak metabolism in some way. So both the lifestyle factors like calorie restriction and also the pharmaceutical tweaks like mTOR modulation or IGF-1 modulation or AMPK are slowing rate of aging. And I'd say that's probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the field right now, both on the scientific side, in academia, and on the biotech side, in terms of companies really trying to bring therapies to market. And then most of the rest of the field is the sort of rejuvenation approach, most of which is damage repair. The idea being there's something that some molecular change that slowly accumulates over time, over many years, and you can quickly reverse that molecular change with targeted therapies that specifically manipulate the molecules in certain ways. And then that reverses, that brings you back to a state with respect to that particular molecular acute, slow process, brings you back to a state that's many years earlier in accumulation level. There are a couple sort of other groups within the field. There's a growing interest in just replacement as an approach to the field, where instead of needing to manipulate the molecules back or slow the rate of change of something, you actually just give us new parts. And it's sort of more the way that we rejuvenate cars and other kinds of machinery. But so you can imagine stem cells are sort of a granular version of that, give new young cells. You can even do organelles themselves. There's a bunch of work on, giving new young mitochondria. Or at the at the coarser level, replacing with young organs, or even doing a whole body replacement, transplant your brain into an identical identical except for being younger body. So that's a growing movement within the field. But I think I'm focused mostly for my investing on the rejuvenation, damage repair approach. And then the other aspect of your question was, what's the current state? So now zooming back out to the whole field, there's been decades worth of work showing this sort of geroscience hypothesis, which I think it's less of a hypothesis now. I call it the geroscience paradigm, which is that, shared core aspects of aging, submolecular pathologies, are the true underlying causes of multiple age-related diseases. And this is something that the world needs to figure out. And the scientists in the field know it, the biotech entrepreneurs in the field know it, but it's still not a widely understood thing, even amongst medical professionals. That's going to change at some point, and it's anybody's guess just how quickly. But, after decades of academic science, we actually started having real high numbers of biotech companies trying to deploy therapeutics embodying this hypothesis within the last decade, roughly. It really started in earnest. If you plot the number of companies founded that are sort of really attacking these core aging areas over time, there was a trickle before about 2015, and then the later half of the 2010s, it really started to accelerate. So we're about 10 years into that right now. And so one of the exciting things that's happening right now is that, it takes about 10 years to get through clinical trials. So we actually have quite a large number of, maybe 10 to 20 things in phase 3 clinical trials right now, or having gotten through phase 3 clinical trials and starting to get to approval. So it's actually the next 5 to 10 years are actually looking very exciting.
And can you provide a few examples of what are the most exciting companies in the rejuvenation, in your opinion?
Well, parlaying off with what I just said, actually, I actually think some of the things that are in the later stage trials aren't necessarily the most exciting. So in some ways, that's a great follow-up question. In some ways, I'd say the things that are most exciting to me are the things that are actually still in the earlier stage of the clinical pipeline, it's still in preclinical, and that's things like senolytics to kill senescent cells, epigenetic reprogramming, which is at an even earlier stage than senolytics at the moment, but has really big potential. And some of the stuff going on in stem cells. Now, there are a couple stem cell things that have actually just gotten to approval. And so I think that area is really exciting too. A lot of what's going on now is that we're getting approvals for stem cell treatments that, lines of research that were begun a decade or two ago. One of the things that's happened in the intervening time is that people have realized that the stem cells often, when they're implanted, they often die, but they still have some beneficial effect. And it comes from the fact that they send out secretions before they die. And it's somehow those secretions are somehow rejuvenating almost in an epigenetic rejuvenation kind of fashion, but it's not analyzed that way at the moment. We can talk about that more. Are somehow rejuvenating some of the existing cells. And so there's a new crop of companies that are actually trying to bring to market therapies based on the secretions from stem cells, which is a little like bring to market young plasma factors, young factors in young blood, except it's from the more limited set of factors that are specifically secreted from stem cells. So that's another exciting area. I think there's a bunch of new good stuff that's exciting in treating the extracellular matrix, which is very difficult to treat, but there's a bunch of new stuff coming along there as well.
Can you elaborate a bit about, for our audience that are not expert in longevity biotechnology, what are senolytics and what is partially rejuvenation?
There are when cells get damaged, they usually die, but sometimes they survive, and usually then the immune system will kill them if they're too damaged, but sometimes they survive that, and then some fraction of them will turn cancerous. And some others will go into a state of cell cycle arrest, meaning they can't replicate anymore. So these are for cells that would normally divide. They go into a state where they can't divide anymore, and that's called senescent. So those are senescent cells. And, there's some debate in the field about exactly how important senescent cells are, but most of the data suggests that over time, as you get older, the number of cells that you have that are senescent and long-lived accumulates or goes up with time. Senescent cells also play roles in wound healing, so that they do normally play roles in just normal immune function, maybe infectious as well as wound healing. But as part of the normal immune response, they get created, but then they get killed or they die off automatically. It's long-lived senescent cells that seem to be pathological. And so there's been efforts in the field for about a decade now or more, maybe a little bit, to try to kill the ones that are long-lived. And the important aspect of this is an intermittent, infrequent therapy. So the idea is that instead of preventing them from ever existing, which might interfere with some of their beneficial transient properties, you simply every now and then kill all the ones that you have. And then their normal function of quickly being created and doing some useful job and going away is not really interfered with. And there's at least a dozen companies working on different routes of doing therapeutics in this area at the moment.
And what stage are they? And do you still believe that it's promising? Because I've seen a mixed result from those companies so far.
The company that tried to go early in the field and use a first generation senolytic agent was called Unity Bio, and they had a failed phase 2 clinical trial for knee osteoarthritis, and then they had mixed results in some eye indications in phase 2, where one trial succeeded in phase 2 and one trial failed. But then the company itself just had a big setback where they couldn't find enough money to keep going, and they laid off all their staff. So that's a bit of a failure, but their approach was sort of a first generation approach. There's a crop of companies coming along behind them, one step behind them, that have sort of what I think of are better next generation approaches to killing the senescent cells. And those were all in preclinical until very recently. Revita, which is one of my portfolio companies, just got into phase 1 clinical trials and started dosing their first patients. And so I'm very excited about that.
And what is the indication that they're going after?
They are, I don't actually know. It's a skin. I think the first trials, they've got a program. They've got programs in skin and programs in a few other areas. And I think it's the skin one that started dosing. I didn't actually look at the trial in detail.
And can you describe similarly the partial reprogramming?
DNA, all our cells have the same DNA, or mostly, other than some random mutations. And, but not all cells operate the same. Cells differentiate into different specialized jobs. And the way that's controlled is through what's called epigenetics, which is basically, which proteins, the genome, the DNA determines which proteins can be made, and all the proteins that can be made by that individual. And the epigenome essentially determines for any given cell which ones can actually be made by that cell. And it's done by things like, how the DNA is coiled up. And also there's these chemical markers, methyl groups that attach to certain parts of the DNA that help regulate which parts of the DNA can be made into proteins and which can't. And over time, in addition to that controlling the cell identity, which kinds of cells do what, over time, there's a certain characteristic change to that epigenome, to the pattern, specifically, for example, of these methyl groups that get attached to the DNA. And people have created clocks based on that to estimate how old different cells are. And another offshoot of that work is that there are factors, there are therapeutic chemicals that you can give to a cell that cause its epigenome to change. And so this started off with the attempt to get cells to turn back into pluripotent stem cells, even after they were no longer. So, take a skin cell, for example, which isn't a stem cell anymore, and turn it back into a stem cell, sort of as an alternative to using embryos to be able to differentiate into different cell types. And so you can do that. You can change the epigenome so much that you actually change the cell's identity completely. Or it turned out that people figured out later that you could use those same factors that can cause the cell to completely forget who it is and turn into a stem cell again. It turns out when you do that, the cell also gets effectively younger. The pattern changes to a younger state, and that is reflected in younger function, younger phenotype. So it acts more young. So then people figured out that if you give those same factors for just less time, you can actually make the cell effectively younger without causing it to forget who it is. And so there are a couple companies, notably 2, that are pursuing those same Yamanaka factors, they're called, some variant of the Yamanaka factor cocktail to the clinic. And then there's a whole new crop of companies that are looking for alternative signals that you can give to the cell that will cause it to rejuvenate in terms of becoming younger, but without actually forgetting who it is, because there's perceived to be risk there because it might cause cancer or teratomas, which is just sort of growth when that you don't want. And so there's a whole new crop of companies working on that, including some very, very well-funded ones. That's the sub area of the space with the most for-profit funding in companies at the moment.
Yeah. And for our audience, we interviewed David Sinclair a few months ago about his data or experiment that he showed how he was able to cure blindness in mice. And this is a very interesting direction, in my opinion, as well.
David Sinclair's company, LifeBio, is one of the 2 companies, along with TurnBio, that are pursuing variants of the Yamanaka factors. In LifeBio's case, they're pursuing OST, having dropped the M. OST-M is the original Yamanaka cocktail. And then TurnBio came out of Vittorio Sebastiani's lab at Stanford. They're pursuing OST-M-LN. So they've added 2 to the original 4. And they have a different delivery method. And then the big companies that have raised lots of money are companies like Altos Labs and New Limit and possibly it's a little more secretive Retro, But then there's smaller companies like Shift Bio, which is in my portfolio, which are also looking for these alternatives to the Yamanaka factors.
Yeah, definitely there is a lot of money there, and it will be interesting to see what will be what will be happening in the future. So those are more like your wheelhouse and what you are excited about. But when we started, you said that there are some companies that are very close to to have a drug in the market, but they are, let's say, in the less exciting domain. So can you name a few and explain? Let us know.
Instead of talking about the company names specifically, let me talk about the categories of things that have gotten approval.
Sure.
So we'll work backwards. So two very exciting things that have happened lately that I'm disappointed more people in the field don't talk about is that there are two categories of therapies that have actually gotten through FDA clinical trials to approval for things that are very clearly targeting core aging pathologies. So in the one case, over the last 5 years, there have been actually about 5 different approvals for amyloid transthyretin, or ATTR, which is a misfolded protein, much like tau and alpha-synuclein and amyloid beta, but it's a misfolded protein that doesn't primarily cause neurodegenerative disease like most of the others. Instead, it primarily causes heart failure. But it also plays a role in several other parts of the body. So it is a misfolded protein that, in geroscience paradigm fashion, really does underlie multiple different age-related diseases, though the dominant one is heart failure. And there's some suggestive evidence from autopsies that a large fraction, possibly even a majority, of people who are the oldest of old, the people who live to 110 plus years of age, that the heart failure caused by accumulating ATTR is actually one of the primary causes of their death. That data is a little bit, it's not very solid. It hasn't been replicated. It's not in detail, but there's a general perception, if you look at the ATTR literature, that ATTR is underdiagnosed and that it seems to play a role in probably more heart failure and cardiovascular disease than people realize, even at lower ages like 85 or lower. And there are now 5 treatments. So I think it's 5. There are 3 or 4 companies that I consider to be aging and longevity companies with treatments, and then a couple big pharma companies with treatments for ATTR accumulation. There's a rare hereditary version where the ATTR accumulates faster than it would in the majority of the people. And they, like in typical biotech fashion, it's easier to get on the market for that because you can get through clinical trials faster. So most of the ones that are approved for the rare hereditary version, but the chemistry is the same in the normal wild type version that more slowly accumulates in normal people. And so everyone the widespread belief that should help most people too, it simply hasn't officially label expanded yet. It's not something everybody's going to be able to go out and get, because in typical fashion, as is the norm for pharma these days, as you go out and get approvals for rare diseases where only a few thousand people or very small numbers of people have them, you price those very high. And so until it gets approved or starts getting prescribed off label for wide, very many more people, it's not going to come down in price until maybe price controls get instituted or it goes off patent. But it's nonetheless, I think, very exciting. And then the other area where there's been approvals recently is that in the end of 2024, Mesoblast got approval for the first mass-producible, off-the-shelf, allogeneic mesenchymal stem cell therapy. It's approved for a very narrow indication, graft versus host disease that's steroid refractory in kids only. But it's nonetheless the first approval for something that's not autologous and it can be mass-produced in an allogeneic way. And a year before that, the first mesenchymal stem cell therapy that's off-the-shelf mass-producible got approval as well. So these are notable just because there's been so much going on in stem cells for so long, and there have been some failed trials, and there's lots of stuff going on where there's suggested efficacy in sort of unregulated stem cell clinics in the U.S. and more offshore. It's nice to see finally some things getting through phase 3 trials. And it's possible this is the sort of first dominoes to fall, because there's a whole bunch more trials coming along behind from some of the same companies, Mesoblast, for example, being one.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an exciting time. And I think that it's a good segue to the platform that you build, the AgingBiotech.info. And I have to say that I'm using it almost every day to look at not about biotech companies, but more about conferences and the podcast and the people, and you even have some research domain there. So a very interesting platform. And can you tell us what inspired you to create this resource, and how does it serve the aging and longevity community?
Yeah, so I got into the field in the early 2010s, and I didn't have a bio background originally, so I started just doing philanthropy and learning what I could from going to events and reading on the side. And then I started doing investing because there wasn't enough grant money to fund all the good stuff, and people realized that you could use venture money to do some of the early stage stuff that's in the gray area between, should this be one more academic study before we spin out a company, or can it be done as the earliest stage of the company? And I realized I had some money I could put to work for that. So I started doing that. And it turned out to be a great way to learn more about the field faster. And, once I started doing investing in any of the companies in the field, and I exclusively invest in companies in the aging longevity sector. So as I went to events, I just started making a list of every company I heard about. And while I was reading sort of everything I could get my hands on, it turned out there were lots of articles about the 20 aging companies, or the 20 longevity companies, or 25 or 30 or 15. And I was looking at my list, and it had 100 companies. And I thought, somebody's missing a whole bunch of companies. And I started talking to the experts in the field, the professors at the Buck and the PhD and postdocs, and the people who were founding some of the companies. And it was clear that the majority of these people didn't realize just how many other companies there were. At the time, which is sort of 2018, the field was starting to get a little bit of success, coming slowly emerging from obscurity, in the sense that there were even things like investment banks, like big investment banks, writing reports, the way they do, because they kind of look at emerging fields to try to get a sense of when this is going to be a really big field. Like you said at the beginning, this is a bit of a revolution, just like AI. It's maybe a little bit more in slow motion because that's the nature of biology. But it really is a revolution, and these investment banks want to have they want to not get too surprised. But you would read their reports and realize that they thought it was going slower than it really was. And I thought, okay, a lot of other investors have their lists like I do, and they just keep it to themselves. I can, even if it hurts my investing performance or whatever, I think instead of making it my secret sauce, I should just open source it, and that will help the field, because all the other investors will learn that it's worth jumping in earlier than they otherwise would. All the PhD students and postdocs who are looking for career paths and don't necessarily want to be professors or find that path hard will realize they have this other off ramp, and all the companies will figure out what other companies are doing similar things or complementary things. And all the other investors can figure out, what are some of the, a lot of times you want to look at a company, you want to see what's the context, what other companies are doing things in the same area. So I decided to open source that list, but also I was frustrated at the time that there was so much prose in the field. There were all these blogs, there were all these books, but everything was all prose. Jim Mellon had just released his Juvenescence book, which was in some ways had this kind of a feel to it. It was like he had looked at all the companies at the time that he published the book, but then he had just pages of prose with colon separated, fields for each company, but they were just like text colons. And I decided I wanted to put something together that was more like an online database. So I put a big table together as a spreadsheet that was sortable and restrictable. So you could quickly say things like, show me all the senescent cell companies and what they're doing, and sort them by how big they are in terms of how much money they've raised, or how many employees they have, or what clinical stage are they at, etc. So I put that together. So for a couple of years, when I released it was like 100 to 120 companies, and it was far more than most people had, and that really shocked some people. And that was great, and I got good feedback. And that's what the site was for quite a while. It was just a big list of the companies. And then there was COVID, and that was a bit of a distraction. And as we emerged out of COVID, one of the things that I did was I started expanding it to cover all these other things, some of which you just listed. So a list of the best conferences to go to, which it doesn't cover every single conference. They're all related. I don't try to cover all the conferences and all the aging subfields, but it's also all the top level conferences. And then, the nonprofits, the best people to follow on social media, the podcasts, including yours, this one, the best books to read on the subject. And it sort of now has about 20 tables, and it's sort of a one-stop shop. So the philosophy has become basically making it a one-stop shop for anyone new to the field to ramp up quickly and to use as a quick kind of reference, almost Wikipedia-like, where they don't have to know everything and they can still quickly find useful information. And then the philosophy of the site, so a couple of the important philosophies of the site, it's completely nonprofit, non-commercial. There's nothing being sold and there's no sponsorship. I don't take money from anybody for it. And I don't have to ask for money like Wikipedia. My conflicts are only that I've invested in some of the companies and that's disclosed. My portfolio is on LinkedIn if anybody wants to see it. But it doesn't give preferential treatment on the site in any way. All the information on the site is public, so nothing that I hear in private conversations goes on the site. It's all stuff where everything that's on there you can find on the web somewhere, and mostly the site itself links to it. So I link directly to the companies and to LinkedIn and to clinicaltrials.gov and to sites that tell you how much money companies have raised, etc. And most of the tables also have some kind of an objective ranking, but it's all objective. So for example, the books have to be listed in some order. Instead of listing them alphabetically, I list them based on basically how good the average reviews are, for example. For the podcasts, I list them basically based on how frequently they're updated and like what some metrics of number of listeners are, etc. For the companies, it's based on things like, how much money have they raised, what clinical trial stage are they at, how many employees do they have, etc. So that's basically the site, the philosophy, and I get a lot of feedback, like what you just said, of people who use it regularly. Some people use it for job hunting, etc.
No, and I have to say that it's not only to novice in this field. I'm using it a lot because it's very hard to remember everything and to know all the companies, all the books, or all the conferences, and it's much easier that someone else is doing the legwork for you. So I applaud for you for that you are doing it and providing this resource. And I really recommend everyone that listening to us, if you're interested in aging and would like to know more about a specific domain or a specific company or a specific book or a specific conference, that's definitely the place to go. And my follow-up question is, what is the future of AgingBiotech.info? Any plan for the future?
Yeah, it's a work in progress, and it's very imperfect. For one thing, the core part, the companies list, it's harder and harder to keep. It's a sign of success of the field that the number of companies has exploded and is now 400 plus, and that's a lot to keep up with. And so for anybody who does go to the site and looks at the companies table, AgingBiotech.info/companies, there are subsheets. These are spreadsheets, and there are subsheets. So the main list that you start with is the ones that have been mostly fully processed. But then there's a tab called To Be Considered, which has another almost 200 or so companies, and those are the ones where it seems like they're likely to be on the list, but they haven't fully qualified whether or not they deserve to be on the list, and the information hasn't all been filled in. So one of the big top goals is to sort of fill that out more fully. But at the moment, at least, I've got the ones that are the bigger, better ones. The ones that are on the To Be Considered list, for the most part, are the small operations that are just starting and haven't raised a significant amount of money or haven't gotten deep into clinical trials yet. So they'll eventually make it on if they're good and they really are aging companies. So that's one thing, is just fill out the information more and keep it up to date. The nice thing about how compared to some of the other lists of companies in the field that other people have had, this site self-documents how out of date it is. So every row has an as of date, which shows you when it was last updated. So you can kind of tell how out of date everything is. And so other ones come along every now and then, and they're fresher for a little while, but maybe not as comprehensive. And then they don't get updated, and then AgingBiotech.info becomes the more fresh one again. So the nice thing about companies is things don't change that fast. So you don't get from one clinical trial stage to the next very quickly. So you don't have to and you don't get from Series A funding to Series B funding, et cetera, very quickly. So you don't actually have to update each company every month or anything like that. Once every several months or every year, updates are good enough to mostly follow along. and the philosophy is everybody can click any of the links to get the updated information. So don't trust that everything on the site is exactly up to date, but you can easily go check whatever's most important to you. The other main thing is eventually we'll try to make the site more user-friendly. Right now, it's not quite, doesn't quite work great on small like phone screens. The bigger your screen, the better. And there are ways that we could make it a little bit more easy. I don't want to make it fully Wikipedia-like in the sense of everyone on the internet having access to update it, because I think that it could be hard to maintain quality that way. But I probably need an army of helpers to eventually, as it grows, make it bigger. And then, part of my time is thinking about making UI changes to make it a little better. But mostly I'm trying to get the full version 1.0 done. There's a few other tables I want to add, maybe diseases, for example, and finish filling out the company. So the philosophy at the moment is content over slickness and flashiness and modern web design.
And currently all the work is done by yourself, or you have a team that helping?
I'm willing to accept any volunteer from anybody who works in the aging field. And so I have a collection of people who come through often just for a little while. There's one guy from formerly at the Buck, Francesco Neri, who helps me maintain specifically the databases table, which was originally his idea. And so he's ongoing, but just for that table. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who are helping me maintain different tables at different times. And I usually call out the volunteers when I make update posts on social media. So one year somebody came and helped me update the conferences table. And so that year when I posted the update, I called him out. I think that was Seth Paulson, who now works in the Biomarkers of Aging Consortium. And there's a bunch of other people who are helping me update the company's table right now. But, it's all as they get little bits of time. It is a great way. If anybody's interested, reach out via the email on the contact page or find me on social media. I'm happy to give just about everybody in the field comment level permission to suggest updates, and I by hand go through them to make sure they're right and then make the updates. But we could use more of that, more such people.
Yeah, that's a great initiative, and thank you so much for doing it. I would like to switch gear right now and maybe talk a bit about current therapeutic and diagnostic in the field. And one of them is, I think, very exciting. In my opinion, it's also a revolution by itself. It's the GLP-1 receptor agonist, and I call it the obesity revolution in a way that it's, in my opinion, it's between the AI revolution and the aging revolution, because it's a bit lagging behind the AI, but it's way faster than the longevity revolution. So what is your thought on that intervention or a drug, and how well is it in treating aging-related diseases or longevity, in your opinion?
Yeah, I have good and bad things to say about this as a target and a class of therapeutics. So first, the high-level most important thing is that right now, the aging longevity field as a whole is way under-resourced, right? 70% of all people who die in the world die directly as a result of age-related pathology, age-related diseases that are caused by these core aging pathologies. That's 90% of people in the developed world in general, 85% of people in the US. Despite that, the US NIH budget is less than 1% to this stuff. And that's partly because people just don't realize, the majority of the public doesn't realize aging can be therapeutically interfered with. And there's 12 to 15 different legitimate things that different groups of people think are like the main solution to that problem to make the public at large really get behind the field en masse. And the GLP-1 drugs are one of those sort of 12 to 15 possibilities. They're generating so much press. If they really get approval for multiple age-related diseases, it could be that they're the thing that convinced people of the geroscience paradigm. And if that happens, then regardless of how good they are long-term, they will be super great for the field. And I think there's a legit possibility that they can help contribute to that inflection point in public support. So that's great. And of course, the money that they're making so much money in pharma, and some of that money is trickling down to aging biotech companies. Okay, so that's the good. Here's the bad. So obesity or in general, overweightness essentially speeds aging, right? It causes, it's one of the things that can cause aging to basically go at a faster rate. And therefore all age-related pathologies accelerate, age-related diseases accelerate, and you die younger. So it reduces lifespan. Many things that people talk about as longevity therapeutics are essentially things that reduce obesity or overweightness, right? Calorie restriction is the most widespread known intervention, and that clearly improves lifespan in all species tried. And obviously, it also avoids obesity. Unfortunately, for public health, one of the things that's happened over the last 2 generations or 2 or 3 generations in human history is that obesity rates have gone way up. And as a result, so for example, in the US, the obesity rate is 42% or something. And, whereas 2 generations, in the early 1970s, the average BMI was 22 or something like that. And not all countries have high obesity rates. In India, it's only 6%. In Vietnam, it's only 2%. But in the place where we run the most medical trials in the US, it's very high, and it's been going very high, going up very high. The GLP-1 drugs may be good treatments for that. To the extent to which they are longevity therapeutics for the average American, in the sense that they really do reduce the risk of multiple age-related diseases and therefore look like they embody the geroscience hypothesis or paradigm, it's unclear at the moment with the current data available how much all they're doing is rescuing the age acceleration caused by the obesity. Yeah. It might be that they're doing more. It might be that if you give them to lean people who are not in any way overweight, have the optimal BMI for lifespan, which a lot of data suggests is below 22 or 22 and a half. It might be the case that the GLP-1 drugs will actually help even those people, but we simply don't have any data to support that hypothesis at the moment. There are multiple companies pursuing these, and there are some even pursuing them for things that you wouldn't think are obesity related. Like I think there's one company on AgingBiotech.info companies that's actually doing GLP-1 as a target in a neuro condition without even having any periphery engagement. But the jury's still out in my mind about whether they're really longevity therapeutics until we get some data showing they actually help lean mice or people. But in the meantime, they're still great because there's lots of people who are obese, and they seem to help them. Of course, the big thing, as a lot of people know, right? They cause a lot. It's hard for a lot of people to stay on them. They seem to cause muscle atrophy. They're not a solution for having a terrible diet, right? You can't just take them and have a terrible diet and then that makes you healthy. It probably makes you more healthy than having a good diet, but if you're just still on the couch and are completely inactive and you take them, you're going to have still muscle loss problems.
Yeah, and there are also a lot of other side effects, and one of them is, for example, they are increasing the resting heart rate, and basically people have nausea and other side effects. So definitely, but every drug has that, and I think that if you look at the whole, and I agree with you, it's more for the obese population. It's definitely, in my opinion, going to extend the lifespan. The jury's on whether they will do it for lean people or mice, and we don't know that.
So two more points. So it will definitely extend the life. All the data suggests that it will extend the lifespan of the people who are overweight who take them. The question is how much, right? Lifestyle. The best epidemiological data in humans suggests that lifestyle makes about a 10 to 20 year difference in overall human lifespan. So that's, diet plus exercise plus sleep plus avoiding abusing drugs and alcohol, not being deficient in various micronutrients, etc. 10 to 20 years difference, right? So if you're overweight, you're nudging yourself to the shorter lifespan and, within that range. And the question is the GLP-1 drug then just nudging you back up within that range, but without actually getting you above that range?
Yeah.
No, we don't have the data to answer that question yet. But it seems to me likely that all it's doing is nudging you back up and not giving you any benefit past that 10 to 20 years that's available with just lifestyle optimization.
Yeah,
so
I agree with you.
The other good thing to say about GLP-1 drugs and the current phenomenon is that the big pharma companies, as a result of the muscle atrophy loss problem, the big pharma companies are all very excited about things that treat muscle aging. And there's a bunch of companies in the aging biotech sector that have legit muscle plays, that have legit therapies that look like they're going to be good for muscle aging. So several of the companies that are doing these stem cell secretions, two that are in my portfolio are Rejuvenation Therapeutics and Immunis. Rejuvenation just got into phase 1 for a rare muscular dystrophy, and Immunis has been, they did their phase 1 and they're now moving on to phase 2 for atrophy caused by osteoarthritis. And, it's possible. And I did a roundup on social media on LinkedIn a while back about like, here are all the companies I know of that are from the aging biotech sector that are working on muscle. And there's, half a dozen or more of them. So it's quite possible that this is going to be a boost to that subset of the aging biotech sector, as all of the big pharma companies that have a GLP-1 play need to pair it with a muscle play. And so that could help the field.
Yeah, and we have seen it with BioAge and Lilly. And I think that very recently Regeneron came with some drug together with the Lilly drug. And they actually show improving, let's say not improve, but less muscle loss with the mix of the drug than the.
And this month, there was news that Rejuvenation Therapeutics did a deal with Lilly also to develop, for them to mine their platform for.
So basically what it's showing that maybe for a young biotechnology company try to piggyback on the GLP-1 wagon and try to get a lot of money from the big pharmaceuticals.
And several biotechs have pivoted since the GLP-1 explosion started, have pivoted to add obesity programs. So for example, BioAge did that, and then they unfortunately suffered a phase 2 setback, but they pivoted and that helped fuel their IPO. Another company in my portfolio called Junevity that's sort of doing reprogramming type stuff pivoted recently to add obesity as well. And so a lot of companies are either adding obesity programs or muscle programs or both. We're looking for therapies that both reduce the obesity while preserving or helping muscle at the same time. And there's a couple like that.
Yeah. The BioAge example raises an interesting question for me to you. Is it smart for a biotechnology company that's working on longevity to get public, or is it better for them to stay private as long as possible, at least until the drug is in the market?
This is an age-old question across sectors, right? Where, I worked for Google in the time where they were trying to stay private as long as possible, which was a sort of a counterculture to the .com 1.0 that happened in the 90s, where everybody was trying to go public and then make huge amounts of money. Being public has a number of disadvantages in terms of needing to go slower to handle some regulatory things. But it comes with a big pot of money. So it's a trade-off. And it also helps motivate staff and can help make partnerships and acquisitions easier if you've got a good market cap. So I don't think BioAge is by itself is a good or bad tale. They had an unfortunate phase 2 setback, which tanked their stock price, but they did still have all the money in the bank that they made from the IPO. So assuming there aren't any lawsuits that try to claw back that money, I think that the fact that they have a platform is great. And if you've got a platform, then you've got other things waiting in the wings. And they look like they're still well positioned to me. I'm not an investor directly, but I'm friends with the company. So I think that, it's a very individual decision. I don't think we can draw a huge recommendation, do go public or don't go public. Wait till the right moment. And if it's going to make you money that you can fund more science with, then it's a reasonable thing to do, as long as you think you can keep going.
Yeah, and speaking about BioAge, they also recently signed an agreement with Novartis about data and the database that they have, a very big deal. So I think that still they're showing that you can receive a high amount of revenue, not from the public, but from a big pharma.
They built a great platform over many years. So
yeah. So we spoke about GLP-1, but there are a lot of other thing in the market. Not all of them are drug, like at least recently, and I think that still today, fasting mimicking diets are very in fashion. What is your opinion about that?
So it's clear that calorie restriction has benefits, though it also seems pretty clear that calorie restriction in humans has lower benefit. It seems like the longer lived the species, the less the benefit of the calorie restriction. And so humans are pretty long lived. So I think there's a widespread belief that calorie restriction isn't going to be super useful above and beyond just staying lean enough. I mean, obviously, it's a lot better than being overweight. And there's a lot of data on fasting of various kinds. You mentioned fasting mimicking, but let's just talk about fasting in general, right? It's kind of a weird umbrella term that people use a lot of different things. Some people call time-restricted feeding intermittent fasting, or there's other kinds of just, fasting every now and then, but like for days rather than for just overnight. Most of the data about fasting in terms of the broad umbrella suggests that it doesn't provide much benefit above and beyond calorie intake reduction. It's just that for many people, it makes it easier to reduce calorie intake than simply reducing it all the time. But there's certainly a lot of experts in the field who believe that it's actually no better than reducing calories evenly all the time, unless it makes it easier for you. There are some clear benefits to things like time-restricted feeding in terms of circadian alignment. You don't want to eat in the middle of the night if you don't have to, because then that actually makes sleep worse. So there's some benefit there. In terms of fasting mimicking, that's Walter Longo's idea that it's hard for some people to do multi-day fasts, but instead of doing a multi-day 0-calorie fast, you can do a multi-day reduced calorie fast, and he's got data showing that it has various kinds of benefits. And I believe some of those benefits are real. I think that it's very clear. A lot of his science is about cancer, and I believe it's very clear that cancer is probably hurt more by fasting in general, whether it's fasting mimicking or full fasting. The thing about cancer cells is they're damaged in some way. They're usually more fragile, even though they replicate a lot. They're actually more fragile on an individual level than most normal cells, and so actually starving them will kill them preferentially, and especially because they're trying to grow so much, and so inhibiting the amount of resources they get, especially protein. They want protein a lot, and also to a certain extent, especially glucose. And so fasting mimicking, if you look at Longo's fasting mimicking foods, they're often things that are low in protein and or low in glucose or both. And so I think that, we don't know the optimal protocols for this, but there's plenty of data that shows that in the context of cancer and cancer risk, that various kinds of fasting or fasting mimicking are probably beneficial. But of course, you have to be very careful because there's cachexia too. And so you don't want to just self-treat yourself. You got to do it in the context of experts. I think that probably that my intuition, which is we're not going to have any data on point for this for a long time, but I think, intuitively, the way we evolved was sort of stochastic absences of food. And so I think it's sort of a ruler approach. If you look at the lines on a ruler, right, you have, short lines, and every now and then you get a longer line, and the really long lines come at further interspersed. That's sort of how a normal markings on a ruler works. I think that a fasting strategy that works like that is probably a reasonably good fasting strategy for things like cancer risk minimization, in my opinion. So meaning, make sure you have long periods of not eating every day, and and every so often do a little bit of a fast, and then every less frequently do a bit bigger fast, and that's probably good. Now, the other thing to know is that fasting and immune function interact. When you're in a fasted state, there's some data that suggests that your immune function is reduced, and so don't do a big fast in the middle of your family all having a bad infection, or during COVID, I reduced my fasting, for example, because I thought there was a higher infection risk at that particular time.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to healthspan optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start Inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
Yeah, and in a way, fasting is similar to GLP-1. One of the major effects is losing weight. That's interesting. Couple of other therapeutic, or let's say intervention that are in the market, and one of them is very interesting and caused a lot of attention recently. There was a paper from the Bach Institute about blood transfusion. And what is your opinion about that? And also, there are a lot of a lot of celebrity like gurus that are using it, and we've seen it.
I mean, the context here is that parabiosis clearly has an effect. Heterochronic parabiosis, where they stitch rodents together, old and young, clearly has some kind of effect. And the big debate in the field are there rejuvenative factors in the young blood that rejuvenate old organisms, or are there bad factors in the old blood that make the young organisms get older? And it's probably a little bit of both. And so some companies have been pursuing finding the young factors and injecting them, and some companies are now pursuing this idea of diluting the bad things by removing the plasma and taking out of most of the stuff, and just putting back albumin, or because taking that out would be bad because it's so dominant. And there's some early suggestive data. There's a couple papers out of the Convoy lab with some good-looking data, and then there's some of these human studies and a company or two pursuing it. The jury's still out, I think. What I've heard anecdotally is I heard one group failed to produce some of the rodent data, and I also heard that a lot of the benefits in humans there's a bunch of temporary benefits, but they go away in a matter of weeks. And so you have to repeat it pretty frequently. And so it's just not clear how much long-term benefit you get by repeating it, and how frequently you need to do it to get sustained benefit. So I think there's probably something there, but I don't know how much.
Yeah, and I think that the end goal is to isolate the factor that young people have that old people don't have, or the factor that old people have that is toxic, and basically find it and then take care of it, instead of transfuse a full blood from young to old and all of that. So
that's exactly right. I made this exact point on in a LinkedIn discussion. The nice thing about the TPE is that if it does work, and if it does work a lot, if the effect size is really good, we can do a bunch of science to start process of elimination to figure out which factor being diluted is how much each factor being diluted, how much does that contribute to the effect? Exactly. And then just actually targetedly dilute those factors, and that might make it easier. And so that's very hopeful.
Yeah. And yesterday I had a discussion with someone about metformin, and I did some research, and there are around 2,500 people today that are taking metformin. And still we don't know what is the effect of metformin on human, but there are more than 2,000 people that are doing N of 1 experiments. So if we can somehow collect the data from all of them and see what is the effect, then suddenly the N and the power and the statistic will be much bigger, that even without a big budget from the NIH, we can start understanding what happened, what is metformin, because there are a lot of, is it good, is it bad, nobody knows, but still some people are taking it, so why can't we use it for the good of all of us? So I think that similarly here, it's good that people are doing it. Let's collect the data and try to understand what is the specific factor, and then allow all of us to enjoy it.
I'm in favor of getting more data from all these people doing N of 1 experiments. There's people taking rapamycin as well as metformin, and trying to collect all the data from all the prescription GLP-1 users. But But a high-level point to make about GLP-1, metformin, rapamycin, TPE, fasting mimicking diets, like most of the data suggests that none of these are going to fully cure aging, right? They're just going to help you slow it down to a certain extent, help you live a little bit longer, but none of them are on the route to really long-term longevity and health span gains. And so some fraction of the field, including me, are primarily focused on those things, the things that are clearly going to be necessary for very long life and fully fixing aging. Yeah. And, some people have even claimed, I was just in a discussion this week on X about, how we don't fully even understand how calorie restriction works. So how valuable is more science to further detail to understand how calorie restriction works? I mean, it only has so much value, right? It might help a little bit, but it's not going to get us to 150-year lifespans or healthy lifespans. So I prefer to put my effort elsewhere.
Yeah, and it makes sense. And maybe for the audience, the longer lived human, she lived to 122 years. And she's one in, 10 billion or so people that try to get to that age. So it's very unlikely that with the intervention that we discussed so far, we can get to that. Partial reprogramming might do that, maybe senolytics and other. But the majority of the intervention, I agree with you 1%, they will allow us basically to make the health span as close as possible for the lifespan, but not much more than that. And but it's a big effect because the health span versus the lifespan today, the gap is almost 20 years. So everyone will be very happy to receive additional 20 years that he can have fun, climb a mountain, ride his bike, or spend time with grandchildren. So,
right. And the other good thing to say about this approach is that, it will enable some people to live long enough to see some of the other breakthroughs.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. So I think that's it's a very good point for the audience to understand. There are the game changers that we discussed before, and there are the other intervention that will allow us to offset the effect of bad genes or bad environment and so on, and allow us the not very lucky people, like you mentioned before, the super centenarian. There are 1 in 10 million or something like that is a super centenarian, get to 110. Most of us won't do that. But maybe with all of those interventions, maybe we'll get to 100. That's also good.
An important thing for your listeners to understand is a lot of these things that we were just talking about, metformin, GLP-1s, calorie restriction, they by themselves as monotherapies will have an effect, a beneficial effect. The part of the field that I favor that I think is the long-term solution is actually, by contrast, a divide and conquer approach. There's a whole bunch of different molecular problems that need to be fixed. Fixing any one of them may not have any effect on how long somebody lives healthy until you get enough of them together. It's like imagining that you have a car that's very heavily rusted, but its fuel injectors are clogging, and its tires are on their last legs because they're stiffening and wearing out. And if you fix any one of those, the car doesn't really run that much longer. But if you fix all of them, then it runs a lot longer. And so, I am in favor of these approaches to find all these diverse things and fix each one of them. But the problem is some people have this mentality where they really expect anything. They don't want to call anything a longevity therapeutic or an aging therapeutic unless it by itself extends lifespan. And that's simply the wrong metric to evaluate things that only fix tiny parts of the problem. So it's in some ways a slower approach to sort of do that, but it's a slower approach to get to eventually a bigger effect size.
Yeah. And we spent a lot of time, and it was fascinating discussing therapeutics. Now I want to spend a few minutes on diagnostic. And there are a few exciting progress in the diagnostic side of longevity. Epigenetic clock, you discussed it a bit before. That's something that is very interesting. but also there are a lot of imaging company that popping around. And what is your view about those diagnostic, and what is the value of them, and what will be the value in the future?
High level, there's a whole bunch going on about diagnostics and tools to quantify things in general, right? There's wearables as well, which you didn't mention. But all these have some value. The scans have value, especially in cancer diagnosis, but they can also quantify the rate of degeneration of various body parts. You can quantify the shrinking of the gray matter in the brain and neurodegeneration. You can quantify with MRI scans the cartilage degeneration and osteoarthritis. One of my bugbears right now is that I'm sad so many people are focused on muscle and not enough people are focused on cartilage in the field, because the muscle, we have interventions that we can do, even just lifestyle interventions that are really effective for increasing muscle mass. We don't have anything there's no disease modifying treatments for osteoarthritis, but we have the diagnostics to track it, but they're not widely available. Nobody just gets full body MRI scans to quantify joint degeneration. They only get it for cancer prevention. And then I have a whole bunch of things we could talk about aging clocks, but let me make the most important point, which is right now, I think there are fundamental new technologies needed on the diagnostic side to do what is the most important job. It turns out it's easy to make things that tweak things in biology. So making therapeutics that nudge something up or down and try to get it closer to the sweet spot or range that what we think is optimal. Like, it's easy to make those nudges. What's much harder is actually quantifying where somebody is on the range that we know is important from lab science, but we don't have clinical diagnostics for doing them. So for example, we know rapamycin seems to be beneficial by downregulating mTOR. We don't actually have clinical mTOR measurement. Like, nobody actually measures mTOR across multiple tissues and tries to quantify who needs mTOR inhibition. But that's similar for almost everything. Like, if you look at the list, and one of the tables on AgingBiotech.info is called therapeutics, and there's sort of a long list of things that exist and are available today that people think some subset of people think are beneficial for aging. And for almost all of them, we don't know which people need them, when they need them, and how to titrate dose in order to actually get to the optimal range. We just don't have those tools. Biopsy is hard and it's invasive, and not all the things are easily diagnosable via a simple blood test. So and all the right scans don't always exist. So this is a big problem for the field, because even as the therapeutics come online, it doesn't, we can run a study that shows that the average person benefits, but it actually doesn't tell you what the right dose is to give to each individual person and which people won't actually benefit. Yeah. So we need more of that. And that's a big hole in the field.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it should be also readily available by a routine diagnostics, such as companies such as Quest and LabCorp, that everyone can test, because we need a big N to start to understand what is the norm. Similarly to what we are doing in InstaTracker, because we have so much data, we can come and say not only what is good for you for the whole population, but also what is the good for a specific subpopulation, like male versus female, a specific age range, a specific ethnicity, and so on.
And I have comments on, if you want to talk about aging, epigenetic aging clocks, I have a couple of comments that I can add on those.
Yeah, absolutely.
So epigenetic aging clocks are very, there's a lot of controversy about them. Are they good enough? Should people be using them, especially the direct-to-consumer ones? Lots of people in the space and in the podcaster sphere have made comments on them. So I won't try to summarize and address those. You can find them on various people's podcasts. Let me just add a few things to the global conversation that don't get said enough. One is that even if epigenetic, the end goal is to make a biomarker that can be a surrogate endpoint. So we have a good enough aging clock that we can test interventions and see if the aging clock moves, then we don't have to do the lifespan study. And that saves us a huge amount of time. And there's a general consensus that right now, the current set of clocks we have aren't good enough for that. But the problem is that everyone's getting a little too focused on that. So that's an admirable goal and great. And obviously we should try to work to get something that's it. But everyone's a little too focused on that surrogate endpoint as the only goal, that they're missing the fact that the epigenetic aging clocks are already better than the number of times you've gone around the sun at what we call chronological age at predicting risk, right? So age, chronological age, is actually used currently in clinical medicine in many places, both diagnostics and therapeutics. So for example, there are recommendations that after age 45, everyone gets a colonoscopy. It used to be age 50, now it's age 45. And, and that's a diagnostic threshold that's based on chronological age. And then there's also therapeutic thresholds. For example, there are recommendations that that even adults, like forget about the childhood development stuff, even after adulthood, there are recommendations that based on certain chronological ages, you get certain vaccines, and based on other chronological ages, you don't. How do they make these computations? They're looking at the risk stratified by chronological age. But we know that some of the aging clocks are actually better at predicting those same risks of age-related diseases than chronological ages. So if they ran the computations, they set the threshold somewhere, because if they set it to an older age, there'd be an aggregate population level decline in health. More people would die if you set the colonoscopy threshold to 55 than 45. And more people would also have negative health outcomes because it's not a diagnostic that has no consequences. It has some bad side effects sometimes. So if you set it to 35, they presumably also feel things would be worse. So if you used a better risk predictor, you would presumably improve overall population health. And nobody's actually trying to use the epigenetic aging clocks that way yet, but they're potentially leaving deaths on the table here as a result, or health benefits on the table as a result. And then the other way that they could get used, because they're better predictors of chronological ages, is in clinical trials. So in clinical trials, you try to make sure that the treatment group and the control group, one isn't vastly older than the other, because that affects the risk. And then your effect size is effectively, you need them balanced, right? Well, instead of just looking at whether they're balanced on chronological age, we should probably be looking at whether they're balanced on biological age, or the best biological age estimate we have, which is some of these clocks. Yeah, so that's one thing to say about epigenetic aging clocks. The other interesting, important thing to say is that if you look at the past 4 or 5 years of epigenetic aging clocks, we had Gen 1 clocks that were trained on predicting age. We had Gen 2 clocks predicting things like remaining lifespan, like grim age. There's been 3 big revolutions in epigenetic aging clocks in the last couple of years. We had Morgan Levine's group show that the test-retest variability was really bad, and there's this principal components way you can boost that. That was a huge improvement. All clocks should have that improvement now. Then we had Alan Tomusiak and Eric Burden's lab at the Buck showing that mix changes, that some immune cell types that are in circulation inherently look younger than other immune cell types that are in circulation. And so it depends on which cells you look at to see what age result you get from these clocks. Well, that's fine. You're mixing them all together. That's not bad, except various kinds of infections and other short-term things can change the relative numbers of those immune cell types. And as a result, you can get changes to the clock that have nothing to do with whether or not all the cells have gotten younger or older, but are only about which cells are more numerous than other cells.
Yeah.
And so this is often called intrinsic age versus extrinsic age. This needs to be taken into account for correct use of clocks in the future. And then the third thing that happened recently is that Vadim Gladishev's lab at Harvard showed that you could detangle the methyl groups that are they're causally involved in making you older versus the ones that are just bystanders or reflective or adjust as compensatory things. So that's sort of the causal versus the non-causal, and that's also very important. Until we go a couple of years without some major new breakthrough in aging clocks, we should know that we should always sort of be pessimistic that we've gotten a really good clock.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point and a very good summary of where are we standing with the clock. And as someone that is deeply involved in both investment and advocacy for longevity, what gives you the most confidence that a meaningful aging intervention will reach the public, let's say, within the next decade or so?
I think there's a lot going on that gives me hope. for example, from the advocacy side, A4LI is this organization that's now lobbying specifically in DC. If I have to pick one thing, I think it's these late stage trials. We have those two groups of categories of things that I mentioned before, ATTR and stem cells that have gotten approval. There's a couple others that have gotten positive phase 3 clinical trial data that we didn't have time to go into. You can find all of these. Anyone who wants to can find all these on the AgingBiotech.info/trials. There's a list of, it's a meta list. It's a list of clinical trials that are related to aging. And the top row is a list that I put together that's just the phase 3 and later clinical trials. And there's a lot going on. That there's 3 that have just had positive phase 3 data, and there's 14 ongoing phase 3 clinical trials that all are targeting core geroscience paradigm embodying things that should mitigate multiple age-related diseases, should help against multiple age-related diseases. So phase 3 trials have greater than 50% chance of getting to approval. So that means we've got a couple already approved, a couple more that look like they're going to get approved imminently, and another 7 or 8 that are probably going to get approved, if the statistics hold, in the next few years. So in the next 5 to 10 years, we might actually start to see multiple different therapies that all embody this sort of pipeline in a pill idea of treating multiple diseases, which the GLP-1s are now demonstrating. But instead of just the GLP-1, what if in 10 years we have a dozen of these that are all getting pressed for treating multiple age diseases? It's going to be impossible for the public not to realize that aging is inherently treatable. And I think that's going to, in my hope, what gives me the most hope is that that's going to create the inflection where society at large gets behind the aging field in a sort of Apollo program kind of way with that level of resourcing.
Yeah, makes sense. And I would like to finish by asking a question that I'm asking all of our guests. And what is your top tip for healthspan and longevity based on what we have today?
My top tip is diet. It's a little silly. I mean, my top tip is lifestyle, right? I think that all the things we have, lifestyle can easily make a 10 to 20 year difference. If you currently live the average lifestyle, you can get, 2/3 of the average lifestyle is about 2/3 of the way from optimal in the 10 to 20 year range that lifestyle makes a difference of, because most people are closer to the bottom range. And you want to optimize diet, exercise, sleep, avoiding abusing all the different drugs, including alcohol and tobacco and smoking, and avoiding micronutrient deficiencies like vitamin D and omega-3. And that gets you a huge amount. And none of the drugs and therapeutics we have on hand are able to outdo that at the moment. And if you want to nitpick and say lifestyle isn't one thing, and I have to pick which one is most important, then I pick diet. A lot of other people say exercise is the most important, and I think it's silly to argue back and forth between them. But if you want to force the argument, it's silly to pick exercise over diet when it's very clear that diet extends lifespan more reliably than exercise in model species. I think that most people just eat not very well, and there's big gains to be had by just even small tweaks though.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great tip. So I think that we are coming up on our time. Thank you so much, Karl, and we look forward to exploring the research in the field of longevity each month with you and leading scientists. For more information, please go to www.instatracker.com/podcast. Again, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion.
It's been a pleasure, and people can find me on LinkedIn and on X and at AgingBiotech.info.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out, using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcasts.